First, I will treat liturgy as social history and not as a separate sphere, disconnected from ordinary life. And second, I use the word liturgy in its broad sense to mean the full array of collective worship practices that people participate in. The context of ancient liturgy in its various forms vividly displays the unique brilliance of Syriac literature and theological imagination, and distinctively and perhaps uniquely, it also displayed the voices of women. In choosing this route, I hope to suggest fresh understandings of Christianity more widely as it was encountered and experienced in the late antique Mediterranean world. So I just want to begin by making sure we all know where we are. And we have some pictures to help orient us here. This is a map of the ancient Syriac world in late antiquity, the period I talk about today from the 4th to 7th century. I'm not sure, I can't see from where I am, but you'll see to the west, you have Antioch. To the east, you're going to Edessa and Nisibis and beyond. Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic that developed during the 1st century of the Common Era in the region of Edessa, which is now in southeastern Turkey, known as Sunni Urfa, has recently experienced quite a devastating earthquake. This dialect of Syriac quickly spread widely and broadly throughout the Middle East and beyond. It continues as the living language today in different dialects, and as a language of liturgy, it is used in communities and in churches in North America, in Europe, and Scandinavia, and Australia, in addition to its Middle Eastern and South Asian homelands. In late antiquity, Syriac Christianity flourished at the interface between Roman and Persian cultures, and it was strongly inflected by both, with its own confident style. Sophisticated, you can see some similarities with Roman tradition and also their own statements. I love the hats, especially, that the women wear. And yes, see, these are families of elegance and grandeur, confidence. During the 6th and 7th centuries, Syriac missionaries traveled far from cities like Edessa. Still, the Roman columns are there, and Nisibis. Here's a view from the Church of St. Jacob of Nisibis. And they traveled, Syriac missionaries traveled south into the Arabian Peninsula. They traveled to Africa, down to Nubia and Ethiopia, and they traveled east along the Silk Road, settling as far as China in the 7th century. And in China, Syriac Christians flourished for many centuries in creative engagement with their Buddhist and Taoist neighbors. So this is a very famous stele with its bilingual Chinese and Syriac inscription. You see also a blending of Buddhist and Christian symbols in the way the cross is drawn and the lotus blossoms. And this is sideways if you read Chinese, but it is the correct way if you read the Syriac. So the stele contains the history of the Syriac missionaries. The first 150 years, this stele is dated from when the Syriac missionaries arrived. And here you see a priest, but you can see the cross, I think, on his head and also on his column, but again, surrounded by lotus blossoms. Now we're back to Rome. In the late antique Roman Empire, the focus of my talk today, Syriac flourished in cosmopolitan cities with grand engineering, wide and colonnaded streets with monumental architecture, elegant theaters, and stunning churches, exquisitely carved and embellished on large or small scale. Syriac Christians then, as now, were known for their remarkable skills as craftspersons in precious metals, adorning liturgical practice with their artistry. We have beautiful liturgical instruments in precious metals by Syriac artisans. Syriac manuscripts are among our oldest surviving Christian witnesses, often centuries earlier than Greek or Latin counterparts. They're often beautifully illustrated. This is here the Ascension of the Rabula Gospels. And with the emergence of Islam in the 7th century, Syriac Christians continue to flourish, and they continue to engage with their larger cultures and to express their own distinctive styles. Just two quick examples: the entry into Jerusalem, and my absolute favorite, and perhaps for Fernando's paper this morning, let me see, yes, the wedding feast at Cana. Again, you see some echoes of Byzantine tradition, but the Syriacs have their own style. If you just look along the top of this orange, at the top you have the wedding at Cana, and on the far right, the young man has come to complain they have run out of wine. And in the bottom panel, you see him pouring the water. It's first a blue, and then it turns into a red line as the water is turned into wine. And their chairs, look at their chairs, are communion chalices. So the wedding it's a wonderful, wonderful scene. I love this scene. All right, let's begin with ancient Syriac liturgy. What were its qualities? What made it distinctive compared with Greek or Latin? And what can it tell us about women? And we'll just have this on to be our company for a while. In many respects, Syriac Christians faced the same challenges and desires as any other Christians in the time of late antiquity. It was a turbulent era, as the members of this room know very well. As the political fortunes of Christians in the Roman Empire improved, converts poured in. Many converts came without knowledge of the Bible, and as converts from polytheistic religions, without awareness of doctrine or the dangers of heresy. As scholars of this seminar have demonstrated often and deeply in your own scholarship, church leaders address these problems both theologically and through the rulings of church councils. But another site for facing the challenge was the liturgy, the worship events and practices that attended ordinary life daily, weekly, and for every kind of occasion. During the 4th century, Christian liturgy all over the Roman Empire expanded dramatically over what it had been before. It became lavish to present a splendor worthy and reflective of imperial favor, and it became didactic, aimed at the entering masses. The liturgy quite literally became the church's school. Remember that this was an era when few people could read, and only a very few would have books. You couldn't send people home to read their Bibles. Other means of instruction were required. In Syriac liturgy, sung poetry was a method of choice. This poetry falls into two broad categories: Madroshe and Mimri. This is your first lesson for today. Let's see if we can find it. There. Madroshe were poems in a variety of meters and melodies, arranged in stanzas punctuated by a refrain. The great Syriac poet, Saint Ephraim the Syrian, here he is, composed Madroshe. Actually, this Ephraim is, as he is in a monastery today in Holland, in the Netherlands. He composed Madroshe in more than 50 meters, more than 50 different meters, but the vast majority of our surviving Madroshe, I'm going to go back to this, were composed in simple metrical patterns, and they were easy to sing. Ephraim's Madroshe, composed in the 4th century, brought a kind of revolution in Christian hymn singing that would soon be followed by Greek and Latin authors. Earlier Christian hymns, you have to think about this for a minute. Earlier Christian hymns before the 4th century were sung either by a solo chanter, or by everyone together. So there's a lot of references in the New Testament letters. Everyone sings. Paul says you bring a song and we all sing it. Ephraim began the practice in the 4th century to change how we see a revolution in form and in performance. The form, to short stanzas of perhaps 4 to 6 lines in a verse, and then a short refrain that everyone could join. So a chanter or a choir would sing the verses, and then the choir would lead the congregation to sing the refrains. So you have a sung dialogue between the congregation and the choir going back and forth. So this would begin to appear in Latin with the hymns of Ambrose of Milan, late in the 4th century. And then we would begin to see in Greek the emergent Kontarkion, which would come to great and glorious heights with the 6th century poet Romanos the Melodist, himself much influenced by Ephraim and other Syriac poets. And it's interesting that a similar form of hymns with verses and refrains, we begin to see also in Jewish liturgy at this era, at the same time with the Piyutim. But it seems the first practice to have these verses and refrains is with Saint Ephraim. And the other form of Syriac poetry, which is called the Memra, is a metrical homily or a sermon comprised in lines and syllables with equal length and in simple couplet patterns, lines of 5 and 5 verses, 7 and 7, or 12 and 12. These were chanted or sung or intoned by a male liturgical agent, usually a priest or a bishop. Occasionally in the manuscripts, we see there also these memory could be punctuated by refrains from the choir or the congregation. And some of the best known Syriac writers from late antiquity composed these memory with lyrically vibrant energy. Ephraim himself, also Jacob of Sarub. Here's Jacob of Sarub. And here he is. Last year was the 1500th anniversary of his death. And this was a new icon we had in America of Jacob of Sarub. The Maronites made this one. Narsai of Nisibis would be another famous author. And Greek counterparts of the same era, for example, this practice of melodic or chanted sermons would be Basil of Seleucia, if you've worked on him, or Ephraim Bricus, a Greek writer whose work is associated with Ephraim the Syrian, but very different. But these Greek homilists were much influenced by the Syriac poets. So both these forms of poetry, hymns and sung sermons, treated a wide variety of subjects on the life of faith, biblical stories, exegesis, and basic doctrinal instruction. Both these kinds of poetry were described in ancient Syriac sources as musically performed by singing. They speak of the wonderful melodies, they speak of the sweet tones very often. The music for these hymns is lost to us, but the appreciation of the music is everywhere present in Syriac texts. Both Memre and Madroshe also followed a pattern familiar from late antique Syriac schools, where melodic recitation and chanted responses were a standard method of instruction. Simple, repetitive patterns helped to make content accessible. Rhythm, meter, melody, or chant are useful aids for the memory, so people could remember more easily. Sung poetry was an effective teaching tool, and it was an effective learning tool. We see its usefulness in the example of Ephraim the Syrian, who composed some of the greatest hymnography of Christian history, much of it still sung in Syriac churches of the present day. But Ephraim also composed madroshe and memre that were intended for his students. First in Nisibis and then in Edessa, Ephraim served his local bishop by teaching those who would go on to become liturgical agents in local churches. He taught clergy, deacons, deaconesses, readers, chanters, and choirs male and female. His extant works indicate a basic shared curriculum for these offices of the church, how to read and interpret scripture, how to understand Orthodox theology over and against the teachings of heretics or Jews, and how to compose and perform hymns. A similar curriculum was followed in local church and monastic schools throughout Syriac regions in both Roman and Persian territories for centuries thereafter. A very extensive surviving curricula from some of these schools. They're very fascinating. So this is our first clue to the presence of women. And I bring back our elegant ladies of Edessa. In Syriac churches, the 4th century included the distinctive establishment of women's liturgical choirs. These were choirs of consecrated virgins, most often identified as daughters of the covenant, Banat Kiomu. These, as they're called in Syriac, these were women dedicated consecrated to the service of their local church, with vows of poverty, celibacy, and service to their local bishop. Syriac ecclesiastical canons from late antiquity and later in both Roman and Persian empires inform us that daughters of the covenant were especially assigned the duty of singing in the liturgies. They were appointed to sing in civic churches, in villages, in towns and cities. Every church, the canons read, every church in village, town, or city must have a choir of women to sing. They sang morning and evening services. They sang at Sunday liturgies. They sang on feast days, at funerals, at special occasions, whether joyful or tragic, to celebrate the remission of taxes from your city, or at the end of a war, or to lament and supplicate in instances of earthquakes or famine or plague. The ancient world was not very different from our own in these needs. Today, and under very changed circumstances and differently constituted, women's choirs remain a living tradition in the Syriac churches. There's been quite a revival of them over the last 75 years. In late antiquity, this was a public assignment for these women's choirs. It was not an aspect, well, it was also an aspect of monastic life, but these are civic choirs. Greek and Latin churches of the same period sometimes included choirs of nuns or consecrated virgins who sang the psalms from the Bible. But Syriac sources tell us that the choirs of the Daughters of the Covenant were assigned to sing the psalms and also to sing the madroshe. So this form of hymns. The word madroshe comes from the root dalat resh shin derash, which means to find out or to debate or to train or to instruct. Scholars sometimes translate the term madroshe as a teaching song. I translate it as a doctrinal hymn because the content of these hymns was that of church doctrine. These did not teach the personal view of a poet. This is not poetry that is about individual genius, such as a holy man or a holy woman might offer as a master to a disciple. Rather, these hymns presented the collective doctrinal mind of the church as a whole, and they carried that authority. So this is an authoritative teaching. In liturgy, these hymns were the special task of women's choirs who were educated and trained for this work. Jacob of Syriac and others recalled that Saint Ephrem, when he taught in the 4th century, met daily with the church's choirs for instruction and rehearsal. John of Ephesus in the 6th century mentions daily schooling for the young girls to train them for this work. Late antique Syriac sources refer to the women's choirs with brief yet vivid descriptions. Jacob of Syriac, for example, refers to the women's choirs as female teachers, malfanioso, in the feminine plural. And malfono is a word for teacher that is used for very esteemed teachers. And so to call these women's choirs malfanioso this is a title of weight. Jacob describes them singing, and I have some, these are small quotations here, songs of praise with a serene sound, with instructive melodies, with soft tones, with wonderful tunes. But these were not simply delightful sounds. These hymns, Jacob tells us, defeated heresies, stymied Satan, and gloriously proclaimed the truth. Ephraim the Syrian not only praised the women's choirs, but he encouraged his congregation, fill your ears with the sounds of the women's voices. Jacob of Serug similarly urged his congregation to pay close heed to the women's choirs, which he insisted were a gift from God for the church's own benefit. In one homily, he extolled the women's choir in a prayer, "O Christ, by the sweet voices of young women who sing your praise, you have captured the world." I find it difficult to imagine phrases such as these from Tertullian or Augustine of Hippo or John Chrysostom. Fill your ears with the sounds of women's voices. The teaching ministry of these choirs merits our attention. For liturgy was more than a communal ritual of worship. It was a social location where women's voices were heard often, repeatedly, loudly, and clearly in public, and as publicly significant. It was a context of social consequence. Within it, liturgical poetry was a site for serious social, political, and theological negotiation. Performance, including performance by women, was as important for that work as the teaching content of the poetry. But women's choirs were not the only source of women's contributions to Syriac liturgical celebration, for women also featured prominently in the congregation, another group whose voices were central and indeed crucial to liturgy in all its forms. Among the congregation, women were present as widows, consecrated virgins, nuns, ascetic solitaries, and as laity, married or unmarried, as family members of all ages. Within this diversity, women and girls were constantly singing throughout the different services. They provided the required punctuations, Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy, the amens, the alleluias. They joined the responses. They recited the creed and the Lord's Prayer. Syriac liturgical rubrics say, when the congregation sings the creed, the walls of the church should shake and thunder out their voices. They sang the collective hymns, like the Trisagion and the Sanctus. They voiced their confessions, their supplications, and their acclamations. Women's voices from the choir led the congregation, and women's voices from the congregation responded in turn, sounding from the assembly. Throughout the liturgy's progression, women's voices wove in and out of sequenced actions, inflecting its sounds and enhancing its harmonies. Syriac poets commented on the fullness of liturgical voice, granting political and social as well as theological implications. In a hymn extolling the joys of Easter, Ephraim the Syrian exults. So I have two verses from this hymn. This joyful festival, we have some parents in the room, I think. This joyful festival is entirely made up of tongues and voices, innocent young women and men sounding like trumpets and horns, with infant girls and boys resembling harps and lyres. Their voices intertwine as they reach up together towards heaven, giving glory to the Lord. Here is the refrain, "Blessed is he for whom the silent have thundered out." And again, a verse that enumerates every participant. Let the chief pastor, the bishop, weave together his homilies like flowers. Let the priests make a garland of their ministry, the deacons of their reading, strong young men with their jubilant shouts, children with their songs. chaste women with their songs and the word madroshe, the hymns of the choir, chief citizens of their benefactions, and ordinary folk of their manner of life. So we have the young girls, we have the young women, we have the women's choirs, and the girls among the children, and women also among the citizens and the ordinary folk. And the refrain of the hymn at this verse, blessed is he who gave us so many opportunities for good. In these verses, Ephraim celebrates liturgy as the ordered gathering of the community. Each part, each person, each voice had a purpose and a contribution. Each carried value and authority, from the least to the greatest. Blessed is he for whom the silent have thundered out. Females of every age and station were present. This much, then, we know simply by virtue of the poetic forms and the performative needs of liturgy, women were prominent participants in this work of the church. Now, what did women model? The presence of women's voices in Syriac liturgies during this era was enhanced further by the content of what was sung. Syriac poets of the time composed hymns and sang or chanted their sermons to tell the stories of the Bible. This they did with great zeal and imaginative expansion, far beyond the biblical texts, including long fictive speeches and dialogues between biblical characters, often cast as lively arguments. Biblical women are included often in these hymns and homilies. From the many biblical women, from the Old Testament, Sarah, Tamar, Rebecca, Ruth, Rahab, Hannah, the widow of Sarepta, and others, and from the New Testament, the Virgin Mary, the sinful woman, the Samaritan woman, the Canaanite woman. There's a very long list of women who appear in these hymns. The imagined voices of these biblical characters were performed often in the first person voice. So the poet would write, I, Eve, grieving for my dead children, or I, Mary, rejoicing at the birth of Jesus. These imagined voices, performed in the first person, were often sung by the women's choirs. Sometimes they were sung by the male preacher in his homily, and sometimes the congregation sang in these first person voices. So there's a gender play going on as well. You inhabit the character as you sing their voice. The voicing could be poignant, as when nativity hymns were cast in the form of lullabies that the Virgin Mary sang to her newborn son, the Christ child. Women's choirs sang Mary's words, real women voicing Mary's imagined song. The refrains allowed the congregation to exclaim their own wonder at the miraculous event, while in effect standing as onlookers at the hallowed moment. An example from Ephraim's nativity hymns presents the favored Syriac image. This is really one of the deepest in Syriac tradition. Mary as the daughter of the poor, which I think is a title also here in Latin America. This is a title, Ephraim, and all those who followed after him. So give an example, quote from a nativity hymn that Ephraim composed of Mary marveling that God chose destitution or poverty for the incarnation, with Jesus born to poor parents in the dirt squalor of a cave. In Mary's imagined, and I think this manuscript illumination has this sense of the poverty of that scene, the grandeur of Byzantine nativities, but this remembers the poorness of it. In Mary's imagined voice, the women's choir sang, "Because of you, O Christ, a daughter of the poor is envied. Because of you, a daughter of the weak is the object of jealousy. Who gave you to me? Son of the rich one, who despised the womb rich women, what drew you towards the poor? For Joseph is needy, and I am impoverished. As the women's choir sang these lines, the congregation responded with their refrain, "Glory to you, my Lord, and through you to the Father on this day of your nativity." Invariably, this poetry, in its different forms, presented women's speech as edifying and wise. Often it was also portrayed somewhat humorously as bold and loud. Syriac hymns and homilies alike presented biblical women praying to God or approaching Jesus by I'm going to quote the words, shouting their needs, calling out with a loud voice, thundering their request, bellowing their need, unashamed, with bold voices, even with authoritative voices. Samaritan woman with an authoritative voice addresses Jesus. These are not portraits of women as humbly silent. On the contrary, these imagined dialogues are often set outdoors in public spaces, just as ancient liturgies often took place outdoors. The imagined voices of biblical women were presented as publicly sounded, with women confronting God or a holy prophet or Jesus or his disciples in the marketplace amidst crowds, insisting on a response to their need or their pain or their faith, now in front of everyone. Sometimes Jacob of Serug used verbs of singing, from the root zamar, interchangeably with other verbs of speech for these women. So he presents the Canaanite woman as one whose loud voice shouted out with boldness, but who sang and proclaimed her request to Jesus like a harp, like a lyre. Such words of singing echoed the women's choirs who sang these hymns before and after the homily was preached, and that marks the congregation's refrains. The same words were used for the women's choirs and for the congregation's song, and the same words were used for the words of biblical women. Amidst those echoing voices, such poetry drew attention to and recognized and gave value to the voices of real women and real women's contributions to the larger social community. A favorite type of Syriac hymn was the sogito, a dialogue hymn. This is a subgenre of the madroshe. These hymns, almost entirely anonymous, took the form of a dialogue between two characters, voiced by two choirs, often a male choir and a female choir, with a short repeated refrain by the congregation. The dialogue itself was a contest, an argument that told a story. For example, a number of these hymns involve the Virgin Mary in contentious moments of argument. So Mary, choir A, Mary, arguing, choir B, the Archangel Gabriel. Mary knows how you get pregnant, and here is Gabriel telling her something she did. So this goes back and forth, right? Or we have Mary arguing with her fiancé, Joseph, who sees that she is pregnant and does not believe her story. Or we have another hymn of Mary arguing when the Magi come at the Nativity. She doesn't know who they are. She will not let them in to see her son when she doesn't know why they have come. And actually, yes, here we have Mary at the Nativity. These dialogue hymns are dramatic and lively. Sometimes they were humorous. The hymns with the Archangel Gabriel are hilarious, but sometimes they are heart-wrenching. The poetic form required that each character had to have the same number of verses for their argument. You remember in the Gospel of Luke, the Archangel comes to Gabriel, the Archangel comes to Mary. He says, Hail Mary, and Mary says one sentence, although later she will sing the Magnificat with her cousin. But in Syriac, you have to have one verse for every letter of the alphabet, each for Mary and for Gabriel. to play out this dialogue. You've got to give Mary a long speech, one verse for each letter of the alphabet. So these were very long hymns, often 45 verses or more. You have to begin with the doxology, you have to end with praise, and in between each character gets each verse for each letter of the alphabet. And this enabled the characters to develop far beyond the biblical text. In the Annunciation dialogue, Mary was tough-minded and witty as she argued with Gabriel over how pregnancies happen and whether or not she should believe what he says. To the disbelieving Joseph, who castigated her pregnancy with brutal condemnation, Mary's verses are steadfast, determined, and eloquent. To the frustrated Magi, whose motives she questioned, she was canny and resourceful, incisive. As choirs, male and female, voiced these imagined characters of the sacred past, the congregation bore witness to the events by sounding the refrain again and again. With each repetition of the refrain, they were observers to the drama, marking its modulations and learning their own lessons. A poignant aspect of these hymns, present also in the homilies that told the same stories, is the repeated theme that women should be silent, and men want to keep them silent. So when Mary questions the Archangel Gabriel, he complains, "Do not answer back to me, do not dispute." But she says that she sings that she remembers that Eve received the serpent without question, and she will not do likewise. When Joseph scorns her claims to innocence, his verses repeat, "Woman, be silent. Woman, do not answer back." But she replies, "I repeat the very same words. I have no other words to say. I will not keep silent." Joseph rebukes her, "You should not contradict me." And she sings in return, "You should believe me." The same dynamic occurred in metrical homilies. A homily ascribed to Ephraim tells the story from Luke 7 of the sinful woman who came to Jesus to wash his feet with her tears and anoint them with fine ointment, wipe them with her hair. In this memra, the woman must argue her way past a series of male opponents, each one determined to halt her force, determined to deny her access to Jesus. The first is the perfume seller from whom she buys the fine ointment with which to anoint Jesus' feet. He refuses to sell to her until she argues her way past him. Satan then appears to her disguised as a former lover, and he warns her that the disciples will try to kill her if she approaches Jesus. She argues past. Then Simon the Pharisee blocks her entry to his house because she is scandalous. Each man is an obstacle she must overcome, and she must defeat only with her words. There is no divine assistance, no angel comes, no saint, no heavenly messenger to help. Her words must prevail on their own. Jacob of Syriac presents the Canaanite woman similarly, but humorously. First, the Canaanite woman who comes to Jesus, her daughter has been possessed by a demon. You know this story. First, the disciples rebuke her and tell her to shut up and leave. And then the crowd rebukes her and tells her to shut up and leave. And then Jesus himself rebukes her and tells her to be quiet and leave, all with scorn, all castigate her. And yet she continues with bold and loud speech until Christ himself acknowledges that she is right and everyone else is wrong. What are the fruits, or what were the fruits, of these Syriac voices, real and imagined? Occasionally, women's liturgical participation was the subject of theological reflection in Syriac hymns and homilies. Jacob of Syriac famously preached a homily in the 6th century in honor of Saint Ephraim the Syrian, in which he claimed that Ephraim himself recruited the daughters of the covenant to sing his hymns. This is a very famous story, actually, in Syriac. And he presented Saint Ephraim as the founder of the tradition of women's singing in a deliberate strategy to fight heresy. In this homily, Jacob started with typology. Because of Eve's disobedience, the mouths of women had been closed. Because of Mary's obedience, her obedient consent, the mouths of women were opened. Just as Moses had led the Hebrew women in song at their deliverance from Egypt at the Red Sea, so did Ephraim lead the Syrian women to sing praises with their hymns with sweet melodies and joyful sounds for the deliverance from sin and death through baptism. Fittingly, Jacob argued that the power of sacramental soteriology. Women should sing loud praise just as men, because the sacraments gave proof of their equality. They were baptized in the same font, they took communion from the same cup and the same bread. He imagined Ephraim calling out to the women, a single salvation was yours and theirs alike. Why have you not learned to sing praise with a loud voice like the men? And with dramatic force, Jacob addressed the women of the church. Until now, your gender was brought low because of Eve, but from now on it is restored by Mary to sing Alleluia. Uncover your faces and sing with loud voice, sing praise without shame to the one who granted you freedom of speech by his birth. Jacob marked the significance of women's voices in the liturgy. He recalled the injunction for women's silence from 1 Corinthians 14:34. I mean, they knew the justifications. Praising Ephraim for establishing these choirs. Now I have a long quotation from Jacob of Syriac. He's imagining, he sings to Ephraim. Our sisters were strengthened by you, O Ephraim, to give praise, for women were not allowed to speak in church. Your instruction opened the closed mouths of the daughters of Eve, and behold, the gatherings of the glorious church resound with their melodies. We have a new sight of women uttering the proclamation. The Greek word here is the Syriac word is karuzuzo, which is equivalent to Greek kerygma, the proclamation of salvation. So it's very important. A new sight. Women utter this proclamation, and behold, they are called teachers, malfanioso, among the congregations. Your teaching signifies an entirely new world, for yonder in the kingdom, men and women stand equal. According to Jacob of Syriac, women's voices in the liturgy counteracted heresy, defeated Satan, converted pagans, and demonstrated that redemption was God's promise for all people. Their singing performed the truth proclaimed in the content of their hymns. Elsewhere, Jacob insisted that laity too must shout their songs of truth, confession, praise, and witness. Jacob thereby bestowed an analogous authority on the lay voices that sang in worship. In his festal homilies, Jacob delighted to present the biblical past, interlacing the liturgical present. He named different biblical characters as types for how and why everyone should join the joyful singing of God's glorious and saving works. In one of his homilies on the Nativity, for example, he presented it like this. I summarize because this takes pages in Jacob, but because a virgin conceived Christ, the choir of virgins can sing praise. Because Christ was born a baby to be cradled in the arms of his parents, babies in the arms of their parents are anointed and baptized in his name. Because Mary was chosen from human women to be his mother, mothers and husbands must come and join the festal song. As Joseph and Mary and the whole of creation sing because of the Christ child, so too all children, all pregnant mothers, all parents, all unmarried, all young virgins must rejoice in song. Adam and Eve, restored and redeemed, rejoice and because of them, the elderly. The Ancient of Days also called forth the model of the elderly joining in song. Pastors and flocks, the church, the gatherings of peoples and congregations from every insignificant mouth and every unworthy tongue, all must sing together, rejoicing and gladdened with God's glory. And sometimes his passages include long lengths of all of the animals and all of the natural world joining their song as well. In such passages, Jacob identifies every member of the gathered church as crucial to and fully participant in the activities of liturgical celebration. The laity themselves become included as ritual agents whose role is as necessary to the fulfillment of liturgical prescription as those of ordained clergy or hierarchs. The church becomes truly a priesthood of all believers, and women are among that collective. Please allow me one final point before I turn to a conclusion. We are nearly at the end. Liturgy was a transactional space, still is. What was heard and encountered there was not necessarily what was presented in the context of learned study. The story of Eve from Genesis 3 provides a poignant case in point. Just as we find in every other ancient language of Christianity, severe denunciation of Eve and her model, women as the daughters of Eve, can be found in Syriac scriptural commentaries and in ascetic and monastic literature. This is not different from Greek or Latin. But these two were texts that were performed in specific contexts between male teachers and male students, or male abbots and male monks, masters and disciples. Liturgy was a different space, different than single-gendered schools or monasteries. Everyone was present at the liturgy. Everyone was included. So Eve, presented in liturgy, was not the same figure condemned in the ascetic or scholarly literature. The Eve of liturgy was the one that most people, and certainly most women, knew best. Here is Eve and Adam waiting for the second coming. Christians who knew her story only from attending liturgies. Remember, late antiquity is a time you did not own a Bible. You only knew the story of Adam and Eve, probably if you were a woman, from coming to church. You rarely, if ever, heard Genesis 3 read as a lectionary reading. In the early Syriac lectionaries, perhaps once a year, in the service on Monday of the first week of Lent, as the 10th reading out of 12 scripture readings, Genesis 3 was read. It was not part of the liturgy. Rather, in liturgy, Eve was present in hymns and other poetry, first as a grieving penitent whose burdens were lifted and whose restoration was exclaimed. In the words of one anonymous hymn, at the birth of Christ, Eve and Adam received comfort in their grief. Or, as Jacob of Syriac sang in one of his nativity homilies, today the mouth of Eve has been opened so that she can say with exalted voice and with careful confidence that her fault has been forgiven. In an anonymous, this is Eve at the resurrection. She stands with Abel and she stands with Adam. This is from a church in the Lebanon, now destroyed. In an anonymous dialogue hymn, Mary herself sings out to Eve, "Let Eve, our aged mother, now hear and come as I speak. Let her head, once bowed down in her naked state in the garden, be raised up. Let her reveal her voice and sing to you, O Lord, for her shamefacedness has passed away in you. Let her hear the message full of peace, for her daughter has repaid her debt." Even Eve, the most reviled woman in Christian theological tradition, is invited to join her voice in liturgical song in the gathering of the worshiping community. Now, in conclusion, why does this matter? First, there's the point of Syriac tradition in and of itself. The history of Christianity has long been dominated by the study of Greek and Latin and the literary, doctrinal, and liturgical material of those language traditions, and they're beautiful and rich. Happily, we are learning to appreciate that Christianity has been a global religion throughout its history. Hence, there is value in other languages and literatures. Language traditions did not flourish in isolation in antiquity, just as they do not flourish now in isolation. Ancient Christian thought cannot be grasped in its richness and depth if we confine ourselves to the study of Latin and Greek. Syriac, like other traditions, was not marginal. It was dynamic, generative, and worthy in its own right. This is not a peripheral history. It was a center of creative, literary, liturgical, and theological activity. Give a strong nativity there from the... Secondly, the women. Syriac women's choirs provide us evidence for important religious leadership exercised by women in a prominent, publicly visible, and audible role. These choirs were authorized by their ecclesiastical institution. They were governed by ecclesiastical canons. They were supported by eminent church leaders and saints like Ephraim the Syrian and Jacob of Serug. They attest women's educated contribution to the religious lives of their local communities in civic and not only in monastic contexts. That civic context meant that these choirs taught men, women, and children. They taught the rich and the poor, the enslaved and the free. They taught the ordained, the consecrated, the monastics, and the laity. Women did this work. And unless we recognize it, these women and their work are erased from the historical record. These choirs were basic to daily life, ordinary life in the ancient world. They are a part of that history. What more can we learn from the practice of these choirs? Scholarship on Christian liturgy has been dominated by focus on bishops and priests, their homilies and their sacramental actions. The spotlight shines on the pulpit or on the altar. To argue, as I am doing, that these choirs played an important liturgical role is to shift from pointed spotlight to a panoramic view. Instead of one or two key ritual actors, inclusively male, we see many, female as well as male. For not only do the choirs themselves come into view, but also the congregation who must sing the refrains and themselves serve as ritual agents to complete the work of the others. Liturgy becomes a composite of different contributing voices, each with its distinctive role, not competing, not necessarily equal, but a mosaic joined together, complementary in their authorities. Finally, the importance of liturgy as inclusive of women's history is also worth noticing. For Syriac, we have no surviving evidence written by women until modernity, perhaps the 19th century. Nothing written by a woman that we know of survives in Syriac. If we take the liturgical role of women into account, then what we have is in the witness of these ancient choirs is a stark reminder that women were there every day, publicly seen and publicly heard, singing and teaching their communities, dispensing the truth of the faith. We do not know anything about these women, who they were, what they thought, what they experienced. But because the choirs are mentioned in our sources, however briefly or rarely, we know that the women were there. For these reasons such as these, the beauty and the power of Syriac literature a fuller understanding of liturgy as a fundamental aspect of ancient Christian life, and the remembrance of women's contributions in history, I suggest it is important to consider what the women of ancient Syriac Christianity can teach us. Muchas gracias.